Hi folks, Wooden Boat Dan here. Just wanted to give you a heads up. The podcast you're about to listen to was recorded several years ago, so some of the phone numbers, email addresses, website links, and time-sensitive information are no longer valid. Please keep that in mind as you listen. If you'd like to contact me, my email address is woodenboatdan@gmail.com. Thank you and enjoy the podcast. Hello there, folks. You are tuned in to Hooked on Wooden Boats weekly podcast episode number 61. I am your host, Dan Matson, aka Wooden Boat Dan. If you can't do it, nobody can. And this is the world's first podcast. That's right, the very first on the planet, or other planets for all I know, that's fully 110% dedicated to celebrating the art, craft, history, tradition, and romance of wooden boats all over the planet. Welcome to the show today, folks. Great to have you. I hope you enjoy this episode, number 61. Won't be long before we'll be announcing episode 100. We'll have to have a special celebration, maybe shoot off some rockets, take a trip around the world, who knows what. Anyway, today's featured segment is an interview with John Lockwood. It's actually part 2 of an interview that I did with John. Last week, episode number 60 was the first part of that interview. The reason I broke it in half is because the total interview is about an hour and a half. So last week was about 40 minutes. This week's about 45 minutes, give or take a little bit. So if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I would encourage you to go back and listen to that before you listen to this episode. You can go to that previous episode by going to hookedonwoodenboats.com/060. As far as upcoming fun stuff that I've got lined up, I'm making a trip to Port Townsend, Washington this Friday, where there's a lot of wooden boat activity and wooden boat people there. I'm going to be doing some interviews, so I'm really looking forward to that. To get over to Port Townsend, I drive about an hour and a half, take a 30-minute ferry, and I can walk about 15 minutes, be at the Northwest Maritime Center, or about a 20-minute drive to the Northwest School of Wooden Boat Building. So I'm really looking forward to that. I love going to Port Townsend. It's kind of like my home away from home these days. And also, I'm working on some future interviews. One person I'd like to connect with is John Wilson. John is the founder of Wooden Boat Magazine back in 1974. So if you see John around, give him a thumbs up for Hooked on Wooden Boats, would you? I'd really appreciate it. Okay, I would like to give a shout out to the new subscribers to my e-newsletter. And this is pretty exciting because I've actually got 9 new subscribers in the last week, which I think, again, sets a new record. I think my last record might have been 7 folks. So I'm going to name these people off here. Jonathan Wren, Tony Bates, Rick Van der Vaart, Peter Goldstein, Jonathan Turnbull, Mike Hunstad, Dan Anderson, Randy Conway, and Bjorn Olesen. Thanks so much for subscribing to my newsletter, electronic newsletter. I would encourage you, if you are listening and you haven't subscribed, please do so. I send out special offers, upcoming interviews that I'm going to be doing, talk about those, make announcements. In fact, this week or early next week, I'll be sending out a monthly e-newsletter with a special offer from my friends over at Off Center Harbor. So if you'd like to subscribe, go to hookedonwoodenboats.com/subscribe. And if you provide your first and last name and your email address, then you'll be on my list. And you can unsubscribe anytime if it's not working for you. So I would encourage you to do that if you haven't already. One of the new subscribers is Jonathan Wren from England. And after he subscribed, or before, I can't remember which, Jonathan sent me a nice email telling me how much he appreciated the show and some things. And so I emailed him back and I said, hey, Jonathan, would you mind reading your email into a computer or your phone and sending me an audio file that I can play on my podcast so I can play that for the listeners, because I love it when people get to use their own voice and give me feedback. It's really much more fun for me than reading emails. So Jonathan did that, which I really appreciate. So I'm going to go ahead and play that right now. So take it away, Jonathan.
Hi Dan, I came across your podcast a few weeks back, and since then I've been catching up on your archive of interviews while driving to work. I found you just at the right time, as I'm just starting my third small wooden boat build, this time a skin-on-frame Greenland kayak. Previously my father and I had built an Ian Outright McGregor sailing canoe and a cedar strip sea kayak to a Bear Mountain design. That was a Resolute. Your interview number 5 was really useful for my new project, and as a result of that I contacted Corey Freeman of Skin Boats and have just received some of the fabric and sinew which I will eventually need in this build, shipped to me here in the UK. Your podcast has filled a gap for me, as I used to download the Furl Sales one in the past. I know this was not specifically wooden boats as yours is, but they used to get some good interviews on cruising with some interesting folks along the way, just as you're doing now. I've just got around to subscribing to your show, so will be interested in getting the boat news every now and again. If you want to have a look at the 2 boats I have built so far, I've got a blog at sailsaltsawdust.blogspot.co.uk. I hope you don't mind, but I have added a link to your show there. It is really good to hear how much is going on in the States on small wooden boat projects. There don't seem to be so many people with that particular bug over here, which is a shame. Keep up the good work with your show. By the sound of it, you are quickly getting a wide audience of like-minded folks, all beavering away on a multitude of home build projects. All the best to you, and keep going with that present boat build of yours that we hear about. I know the feeling when you think you're almost complete, but launch day seems to be just slow in arriving. The final third always seems to take longer than the previous 2/3, at least that's my experience. Anyway, kind regards, Jonathan Wren, England, UK.
So thanks so much, Jonathan, for your feedback. It's feedback like this that really keeps me motivated to do this podcast every week. I mean, it's really exciting that people all over the world are listening to this and gaining some benefit from it. And really my whole purpose in doing this, really besides me having fun, is for you guys to have some fun and also to bring some new folks into the wooden boat fold. People that aren't that familiar with wooden boats, and get them excited about it and maybe even build a boat for the first time. I mean, I think that's so awesome. I'm kind of a small boat guy myself because I can build them quicker, which quicker isn't really quick. In this case, 1 to 5 years, but I know if I was to take on a big project like, 20, 30, 40 footer, that could take a long time. So I like small stuff. But anyway, I just want to encourage anybody out there that has never built a wooden boat or used a wooden boat to go for it. If you have questions or comments about that, please give me a shout, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. Okay, we're going to move on to the interview, not the winter view, although there is a winter view out my window right now. It's raining and cold here in Washington again. But interview today with John Lockwood. Again, this is part 2. Last week was episode 60 was part 1. So let's go ahead and roll this. Take it away, John. So what happened after that? How did you get from Seattle to starting Pygmy Boats, Pygmy Kayaks at the time?
So when I came back from the Charlottes, I ran out of money and had to go back to work. But now I was still on crutches and a cripple. And I couldn't just pick up some job, Well, I guess I could have. I probably should have. But what I did was I went to work as a computer programmer. And, back then, it was before PCs had been invented, and, you were working with a mainframe, and you came on board a place, and you had to learn the languages that they were using, the computer languages and the operating system that they were using, and it would be at least 6 months. I mean, you could be functional right off the bat, well, within 2 or 3 weeks, but it would be at least 6 months before you were really, really earning your keep and writing a lot of really good code, that was tailored to the system that they were using, and if you walked away, it was devastating. I mean, so if you have some job as a, picking rye out of the wheat, that was the first job I had, was walking through the Palouse, these huge rolling hills, barren hills, giant rolling hills, very, very beautiful in eastern Washington. I got the job at a time of year where the rye seed that was in the wheat fields was like 6 to 12 inches taller than the wheat, and you got docked if you had rye seeds. They would take a small quantity of your wheat and literally count the number of rye seeds, and they'd pay you less money for your wheat if there were too many of them. And they didn't want the rye to go to head, and I did that all day long. These beautiful puffy clouds and the dusty area. There's gorgeous sunsets every night. Just walking all day long up and over these hills, pulling the rye out and just throwing them back on the ground. Well, a person can leave, and you can replace somebody to do that without too much trouble.
Yeah.
They might not be as much fun, but you're not hung up. Well, you lose somebody that, finally really knows what they're doing in your computer shop. You're in a world of hurt. So it just changed my life forever. I mean, it was this characteristic that defined my life of being able to be mobile and flexible and spontaneous and spend at least half my time. I basically just was a wilderness freak. I mean, and and that's what I did, and I funded it by working, and I just couldn't do that anymore. So what happened was I would work until I couldn't stand it anymore, not until I had enough money, and then I would take off, and I would take off for a longer period of time. And it took me 2.5 years in the Charlottes to run out of money. And I didn't have that much saved. I think I only spent like $1,500 in 2.5 years while I was there.
Really?
Yeah. 5 months every summer it was totally, almost completely free. I mean, you wouldn't believe the list of stuff I ate. I mean, it's a podcast in and of itself.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what I was doing in Seattle.
Yeah.
And when I was, in 1985, I quit my job and spent a year writing software to do hard giant boats, and because there was none available. So there's a whole nother part of the story that would have been just as interesting to do.
Yeah.
But
I wrote down something here that you did. Plate expansion software?
Yeah.
Is that what that was?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I worked in Poughkeepsie, New York for, I think it was about 4 years. And then when it wasn't that I'd made enough money, but that I just said, okay, I couldn't deal with it anymore, and they'd really gotten their worth out of me. And they really had. I was really good at what I did.
Yeah.
But I stopped at the Bath Boat Building School in Bath, Maine, and the state-funded boat building school in Lubec, Maine. Was actually thinking about setting up a business to make stitch and glue boats in 1977. It actually didn't happen until 86, but that was my first hard look at it. And I talked to the professors at both of their schools as to whether or not there was a computerized method of doing this. And they didn't know of one. And a couple of years later, when I was in Seattle, I actually called after I'd worked for like 4.5 years straight, I was back in the same situation.
Yeah.
And I actually opened up the Yellow Pages. I took it off the bookshelf right next to my desk and opened up the Yellow Pages to naval architects. And I dialed the first person on the list, and I got a receptionist, and I said, "Hey, blah blah blah. I've got this question I want to ask a naval architect, about plate development." And she said, bless her heart, "Yeah, well, okay, let me ring you through to," I can't remember his name now. I should. I don't even know if I got it written down. One of the naval architects, and she did, and bless his heart, I gave him the spiel, and he went, "Oh, yeah. Yeah. I think there is." And we talked about it a little bit, and he said, "Yeah, there was an article that was published in 1974 so this was 85.
Wow.
So I was like, and this is not his specialty. This is some. And he said, "Yeah, there was an article published in 1974, I think it was, in the Journal of Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, that was about this topic. And I don't remember the name of the person who published it, but there's a naval architectural school at the University of Washington. They have a library. Go out and look through 1974 and 75, and I think you'll find it." And he'd never he'd read this. He'd never gone and looked at it again. This really blows me away. I wish I had that. I don't begrudge the skills I do have and the talents I've got, but that would be handy.
Yeah.
So I went out there and found it.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And it was actually a mathematical presentation with a few drawings as to what ruling lines were and it described the topological class. I was strong in math and physics. Those were, and plane geometry and applied logic, and these were my strong suits. But so there's an area of topology which mathematically describes surfaces, and there is a special class of topology which is developable surfaces, and these are surfaces that you can essentially lay a piece of paper over, and the paper will mate the surface without wrinkling. So you can't take a piece of paper and wrap it around an orange without it wrinkling. So anything which is a developable surface can have plywood laid on it. So this defines the class of objects that you can make stitch and glue boats out of.
Really? And so that's a mathematical equation.
That's to
develop those shapes.
Right. It's a domain of topology, and it's a domain of mathematics. And the math was just like, it wasn't an integral. It wasn't anything that I was really familiar with. So, but at this point I had left Boeing, and I was working for an actuarial firm. And these are the guys that calculate your insurance premiums.
Right.
Your automobile
heavy
insurances.
number crunchers.
Yeah. So they take huge categories of people and process data in a time series statistical fashion.
Yeah.
And so the normal route for an actuary is to major in math, get a doctoral in math, and then pass his actuarial exam, which takes about 4 years. So these guys have more time in school than doctors.
Wow.
And brain surgeons. And there was one of the guys there who was one of the actuaries who had gotten a computer bug. It was totally in computers, and he sort of had, of his own volition, really switched to the other side because it was more fun. He still got paid buku bucks for being an actuary, but he was a really nice guy, and I went into his office and just showed him this paper, and he's just scanning it, not a dyslexic. It's like, glances at the thing for 30 seconds and flips the page. And he goes, yeah, no, I get this. And he's talking blah, 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 blah. And he's talking math. And I said, well, can you describe this in computer algorithms? Because a Turing machine, which is a little tiny computer that you can draw on a piece of paper, it's essentially a square box with a bunch of cells, like a tic-tac-toe thing, with a piece of paper tape that just has zeros and ones that goes forward and back through it depending upon what the instructions are in each one of these boxes. And it's been proven that you can do all of mathematics with a Turing machine.
What kind of machine is it called?
It's called a Turing machine.
Turing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This came from Harvard. I took a graduate level class in autonoma, and it was in the applied mathematics department, and finite autonoma. And so anyway, he translated what his understanding of this into just describing the algorithm, the mechanics of how you would solve this problem using computer code, which was actually very easy for me to understand. Except, so I went home, I worked for like 6 months on this thing and got a working prototype, and it wasn't producing results. And I had quit by this point, and I went back in, I called him up, I went back in and showed him what I had, and it wasn't working. And he went, oh. So he asked for the paper again. He sits down at his desk, like, this is a 15-minute visit. And he sits back down at his desk, and he's going back through this paper. Oh, he says, I made a mistake here. So there's another 5 minutes, which is describing the essentially mechanics, how you need to rewrite this. So I go home and rewrite it, and it works. And but it took me, believe it or not, almost an entire year to produce this piece of software. And I managed to just pay my bills, just barely pay my bills by working with some naval architects in Seattle that were building big steel ships. And steel's another piece of plate. And steel boats are of two types, and sometimes they're a combination of the two. They're developable surfaces. And you can actually press, because steel is malleable, you can bend the bilge in steel. So sometimes the whole bottom of the boat up to the bilge is developable, and the whole upper part of the hull down to the bilge is developable. And they use big pressing machines or other mechanical methods of putting force to the plate to bend the bilge and shape it, and then they weld it all together. So so this software was sold around the world. I only sold about 450 copies of it, but it went to, there were 3 to Australia, to Finland, Norway, Sweden 2, England, Japan. I can't remember. I think there was one that went to Brazil, and it was sold through one of the naval architects that I was working with, who sold software, and that's where the end of this thing comes together in terms of how my breaking my hip, produced the things that the thing I forgot to mention directly is the other component of breaking my hip was that I was a wilderness freak, and truly, and the only way I could get into I couldn't carry a backpack. I was still on crutches, and the only way I could get into the wilderness that I managed to figure out was in a kayak. Mm-hmm. So that's why I went down the Yukon River in a kayak. Was it that first? I guess it was probably the second. Well, it might have been. Was it? It was probably about a year and a half after the accident. I discovered kayaks and learned how to roll in the Harvard pool.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so how's that? Is that you? I mean, it goes on and on and on. I mean, I can go on forever about kayak design and how to
Let's take it from here, John. And let's talk about Pygmy Kayaks then. So tell me about when you started that and kind of what's happened with that over the last few years here.
Do you ever do? Does this get broken down into multiple casts?
Only if it's more than 5 hours.
Oh my God!
No, I'm just kidding. No, we'll keep this going. I'll decide that later. Okay?
Because we could get together again.
I know.
And
I know.
And do that.
But let's talk about Pygmy Boats.
Okay.
That started in 1985. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And why did you decide to start that?
Well, I had worked since '74 as a computer programmer, so it was 11 years and almost 12. And you want the honest truth?
Yeah.
So I was really good at it. I mean, I used to stay up until 2-3 in the morning in the computer lab at Harvard, And so I was known as a hunter-gatherer freak. There were like 7 or 8 of us in the university that just totally got into hunter-gatherers. And what they had to say to modern people, their life is really radically different. And in many ways, they only work 18 to 22 hours a week on all subsistence-related activity. And it's a lie that they don't have leisure time and that life's struggle for existence is complete, total lie. Like almost every cultures are, that's what they do. They pat themselves on the back and strut around telling lies. And they have the best refrigeration system that's ever been invented. It's leaving it alive on the hoof or alive in the ground.
Oh.
And during extreme stress, like droughts, the first people to all die off around them were the farmers. All their crops wither and die. And then the next people to die off are all the pastoralists, the people who herd cattle. And, there's still a few porcupines and udu and snakes and, all the desert-adapted animals are still mostly alive. And there's a bunch of tubers and desert-adapted plants that survive droughts. And, they don't have quite as much food to eat, but they don't get really stressed at all in terms of hunger.
Yeah.
And they don't die at the age of 35. That's totally stupid. Their life expectancy was probably 40.
Yeah.
But if you lived past the age of 5, your life expectancy was 60.
Oh.
And the percentage of people who are over the age of 65, in their culture is the same as it was in England in 1840 or 1860. And they're not stooped and bent and broken people, when they're 40 years old. It's just a lie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, So back to why I left. I had sat behind a desk for 12 years, and frankly, writing computer code is like building a machine that has 200,000 moving parts. And you have to design the entire thing before you start writing code, or you'll just end up with junk, which is unmanipulatable and it doesn't work right. So you have to develop the tools and the capacity to visualize these really large-scale problems, and you have to develop the tools of being able to design them on paper before you write code, and to interview all the people who are going to use it.
Yeah.
So that and you have to do it right. There are very few people that do it right, and I would be exhausted at the end of the day. I would come home. I'd sit down. I'd watch the early local news. I mean, the early national news, and I and my partner, you make some food, and we'd sit and watch the national news, and then by the time the second local news was over, I was asleep. And it went on like that for years.
Oh, man.
And this is like so wildly different than what I'd been as a young man. I was really good at it, but I couldn't figure out how to extricate myself. So this was how I did it. I stopped once again, and I was looking around for something that I thought I could be in control of, that I could pace myself at. It was under my control.
Yeah.
And I thought the skills, I was still disabled to the extent that I couldn't carry a backpack or pedal a bicycle or go on really long hikes. I had by that point a metal cup in my hip joint, not a totally up. It was, anyway, another story, and it had some limitations. So I took up boat building because it combined the skills I had. It was and the passion. So all my wilderness travel had been for the last 20 years done in kayaks, and which is where my passion was. And I had already designed and built a kayak, a boat using the traditional methods, mm-hmm. and I had discovered a computer algorithm, and that would enable me to bring a level of technology to it that's frankly completely revolutionized kayak design. I mean, the kayaks that I design now are so much more sophisticated than the ones that were available, from Granta in England. It's just light and day, and the thing that's enabled that has really been the computer. Both my knowledge of kayaks and my experience with them. You have to know what you build usually to get a really good product.
Yeah.
But it gave me a tremendous leg up. And when I built that software, as far as I know, I was the first. I tried to buy software. I called all over the world, Canada, Texas, Australia, England, and Norway, trying to find software to do it, and couldn't. And the only reason I designed it was because I couldn't find it. And so I had this tremendous technological advantage. And I think I was, as far as I know, I was the first person to produce this plate expansion software in the world. I ran into a couple of other people that were using something like it on their in-house computer, but it hadn't been written into a software program that was actually had a user interface on it, mm-hmm. and not sold commercially, and was not available for purchase at any price. And but I also think, at least in terms of kayaks, and at least in terms of the United States, that I was the first person in the United States and Canada to design a kayak on a computer that was commercially produced.
Yeah.
And I kind of came out of the box pretty slow. I started up as a single person, and 5 years into the task, all I had really designed was one boat, the Queen Charlotte, and produced it in 3 different lengths and widths. And it was very frustrating to me that I had spent so much time just cutting, boxing, shipping, creating catalogs, manuals, ads, answering the phone, doing the accounting. I did everything. I had no accountant, I had no lawyer, I had no business partner, and I had no financing. So the savings that I had made from working at Boeing and the actuarial firm carried me for a couple of years. And pretty soon I managed to just pay the bills, but just barely. And it wasn't until I started to get some employees that freed me up enough to be able to start spending more time in design that I caught up to my own potential a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that was real frustrating, because I felt like, wow, time was going by, and I felt like I needed to, do this and use what I had.
Yeah, because you really wanted to focus on the design aspect probably and not worry about, cutting the parts and shipping them and...
Yeah. What's interesting, I just finished reading an article about they were describing one of the differences between Europe and the United States. This was actually about mathematicians and inventors. And they were saying that the Europeans were much, especially the inventors, were much more into just doing invention and doing theoretical research. And that Americans contrasted in that if somebody invented something, it wasn't worth anything unless it became worth something, unless they actually could make something from it. And the test was whether or not it made money, was what they said, that American inventors almost always tried to implement it, to tangibilize it, or it was wasted, and that this was not the attitude that Europeans had. And I designed the software to do kayaks. I didn't design the software to patent it. And because I'd gotten it out of the mathematics, at least, it was open source public information. I didn't think it was patentable. It turns out that's untrue. I could have patented. It wouldn't have, because I worked I think I knew that actually, but I also knew that, VisiCalc got wiped out by Excel. I mean, all the early leaders in software as well. And so you can, exactly. Excuse me. Yes, VisiCalc got wiped out by Lotus, got wiped out by Excel. Yeah. Right. And there's lots more to tell about all of that as well.
Are you using your own software today that you wrote, John?
I am.
Are you really?
I am. So I'm using a variety of software, but I took the software proprietary in probably about 92, so I sold it from 86 to maybe 91. It was just like 4 years. And then there was someone else who had come on the market starting to develop software. One of the very early mistakes I made was that I contacted Wooden Boat magazine and asked them to do an article about this new, branch of boat building that I had thought I'd created. And not really, stitch and glue was done in Europe, but I was the first person to actually computerize it and to start cutting it on computer-guided machines and start selling it. Not the first to start selling it in kits, but to wrap that all together into kit form.
Right.
And I approached Wooden Boat magazine about whether or not they wanted to write an article about that. And I actually wanted them to write an article about building them and showing the process of them going together. And they didn't like that idea. I didn't realize until quite a bit later why. But they wanted to write an article about the computerization of the process. And in my naivete, I was flattered. I said yes. So I wrote this article that was published in 1987 in the December-January issue of Wooden Boat that's about developable surfaces and uses the Queen Charlotte. There's pictures of it, of the lines drawings and the expansions and the finished boat. And there's also a description of the mathematics and a reference to the source material. In this article. And,
So that got snatched up
it took about 4 years before somebody, started producing software. And at first it was just to the big steel shipyards where the money was. And I really didn't want to do this because I was working 60 hours a week just at the level I was at in Pygmy Kayaks, which was real small. And no Pygmy Kayaks. And but later, everybody who's my competitor now, uses software. And they're all essentially, either aware of that article or they're aware of somebody who wrote software package who was aware of that article, or they're not aware of anything except there was a program called Pygmy Boats that was available for $75, in the back of Wooden Boat magazine, a little teeny classified ad that did plate expansions. And so at that point, my survival really, first of all, the software that I am still using, is a more sophisticated version of what I used then. And I decided to take it proprietary. That helped a little bit. But the real key to the continuing success of Pygmy has been my ability as a designer, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only one place that you can go to. There's two now, but there used to be only one place that you could go to where you could get objective information about the quality of a kayak. And it was Sea Kayaker magazine. And they do these formal reviews where you deliver them a boat, and that's the end of the conversation with you. And they find 3 or 4 expert paddlers to paddle it. And you don't know who they are, you have no access to them, and then they publish these reviews. And my boats have gotten consistently some of the best reviews on the market. And many of the reviews, you're really hard pressed to find a boat that's made of a fiberglass kayak or a carbonate kayak or a plastic kayak, a polyurethane kayak that gets the kind of reviews that these boats do. They handle really well. They don't need rudders. They're designed to track well and to handle wind and waves well. So that's what, that's sort of where Pygmy's ended up finding its long-term niche, is just our skill at designing and producing, this particular boat that I could have done anything, I mean, there's nothing to prevent me from designing a 37-foot transoceanic sailboat as a stitch and glue boat. It's not particularly. Interestingly enough, kayaks are very, very sophisticated hulls. If you want to paddle a kayak without a rudder, it has to really behave straight. If you've got a big old power boat, you can turn the prop hither and yon or have a rudder on it.
Yeah.
If it's a dog, and it doesn't have a particularly efficient hull speed, for most boats you just put more power to it. I mean, most of the boats that most recreational people have are planing hulls,
Right.
And they just have to have a flat run.
Yeah.
There's not everything has sophistication. So every single boat category competes based on sophistication that they've got.
Right.
But the degree of analysis that I do of a kayak hull is really spectacular. And I've talked to people who are naval architects who are doing sailboats and bigger boats, and they've never used half of the hydrostatics and kind of arithmetic analysis that I do on kayaks.
How many designs do you have now that you sell, John, in your kits? 21 or something?
I think it's 21.
Yeah. Okay.
So that means that it's 19 different kayaks.
Yeah.
Where it depends on how you count it, because our newest boat is actually available in 2 different hull shapes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
One is a stiff tracking boat that likes to run straight, and the other one has a lot of rocker and is very maneuverable.
I see.
And both of them are designed to still track.
What's the name of that model?
It's called the Merlet.
The Merlet. Oh, okay.
But there are 4 decks that go on either one of these hulls. So the shear line on each hull is the same. There's 4 different decks choices that you've got.
Oh, wow.
And so that's 2 times 4 is 8. And then there's 2 cockpit sizes that you can get, which is 16.
Yeah, it adds up quick, doesn't it? Yeah. What's your most popular model over the years, John?
Over the years or now?
Well, let's say now. What's the most popular model?
Because over the years, it's probably the Coho.
Okay, I was wondering about that.
And it's still a really popular boat. It won the Reader's Choice Award as the best wooden kayak on the market for 2011 through 2014. And prior to that, our Arctic Tern kayak had won it. But right now, our best-selling boat is a recreational kayak called the Pinguino.
Okay, I test paddled that here last year.
And it's the Pinguino 14.5, which also
kind of a recreational, kind of a combination hybrid type boat, right?
Right.
Yeah, a little more stable,
very much more stable
for a novice to handle,
right? But
still a lot of the capabilities of a traditional boat.
Yes.
Okay.
So oddly enough, it has less wetted surface than a Coho or an Arctic Tern because it's shorter. It has very sweet, smooth lines.
Yeah.
But massively stable. But because it has real fair lines, it has less wetted surface and is faster at cruising speeds. So until you get up to the hull speed and the boat can't go over any faster, it actually paddles with less frictional resistance than the Coho or the longer boats do.
Yeah.
And it has enough storage space for doing a 2-3 week camping trip. So it makes a great play boat. It's real maneuverable.
And it's only 14.5 feet long, so it's not, you're not dragging a big boat, long boat around.
Right.
Yeah.
But it has a long enough waterline that you can paddle like 4.4 miles an hour, which is, most people don't cruise any faster than that. So you can stay up in club paddles and stuff. So anyway, and right now there's just about to be a turnover. We've got a brand new boat called the Pinguino 145 for 14.5 feet, 4PD, which is an acronym for one of the Merlet decks. So there's the Merlet version 1 and version 2 hulls with 1PD, 2PD, 4PD, and SDC for the decks.
Okay.
But just to keep this thread, the 4PD has a 4-panel rear deck and has enough room under the rear deck to use as a touring boat. And the 1PD is a flat panel rear deck for people who, for whatever reason, want a really low rear deck. They both handle wind and waves pretty much the same. There's not much of a functional difference.
Yeah.
But we put this whole new line of Merlets and this new Pinguino were all designed specifically for people who have gotten the bug of learning how to do Greenland rolls. And to do a Greenland roll, the core method of rolling in a Greenland roll involves you swinging your body and your paddle out along the surface of the water in a big rotational motion that's almost 180 degrees of sweep, and you end up on the rear deck, lying down on the back of the boat, which keeps your center of gravity at the water level almost the entire time the roll is being done, which means that the boat can roll much more easily than if your body's out of the water, gravity's carrying it back down.
All right.
So it's a core characteristic of Greenland boats that they have a very low rear cockpit height, not necessarily a super low rear deck height, but you have to be able to bend your body right down flat over the rear deck.
At your low back area, you got to be able to get that area down.
So I've got a utility patent actually on the way the rear of the cockpit transitions into the rear deck. So I've got design patents on all my boats, and this was the first of the utility patents that I'd gotten, which is much more all-inclusive. Covers pretty much anybody that tries to compete with this process. And that boat has been given us, so the Pinguino 145 4PD has been redesigned from a wrecked boat to be a surf boat and a boat for rock gardening and to be taken out into really nasty conditions. It's stable, yet it's real maneuverable. It It surfs really, really well. All three of the Pinguinos surf real well. But once we realized that this was really a dynamite surf boat, for a sea kayak, it really surfs it's one of the best ones on the market.
Wow.
There's specialized surf boats that are better, that are only 8, 9, 10 feet long. But for a 14.5-foot boat, this is really a dynamite surf boat.
Wow. Great.
And the other Pinguino, which is 13 feet long, is really a good surf boat.
Cool.
And we're going to probably put a low deck on it too.
Yeah.
So you get this combination where you're in a smaller cockpit where where the hip struts are narrower, where you can get really braced into the boat. We have very aggressive sort of thigh braces that we've put into it. And you have this ability to execute these rolls that are much more reliable and easier for the normal person to do.
I see. Cool. So, John, for people listening that want to get more information about Pygmy Boats and what you guys do and what kits are available, can you give me your contact information, website information?
Yeah. So you can reach us you can get a hold of us at www.pygmyboats.com. So PYGMYBOATS, all Y's, no I's in the Pygmy. And you can also get us at area code 360-385-6143. And you can email us at info@pygmyboats.com. So Pygmy Boats spelled the same way with no spaces.
Very cool. And then one last question, John. We'll wrap it up with this. For somebody that's listening that's never built a boat, tell them why they should buy a kit and why they should do it that way. What the advantage of that is.
Yeah.
I don't know that.
No, that's a good question. So the short answer is that if you acquire the materials yourself and you don't live right next to a major center of very high grade marine plywood and epoxies and stuff, and have to have that all shipped to you at retail prices, you will pay almost as much for the materials as you will the kit. So the second key component is that the easiest thing for us to do is cut these long, fair curves. There's no straight lines anywhere in the panels that make up this boat. And if you build from plans, that's what you get. You get plans for the panels. And you then have to cut out by hand these long, fair curves. And it's really difficult to do by hand. It's difficult to do with a handsaw. It's really difficult to do with a jigsaw. It's really difficult to do with a bandsaw. It's just really hard to do. So you're taking on the hardest part of the task that happens to be the easiest part of the task for us. That's letting the computer do that is a simple thing to mass produce. Mm-hmm. And our parts will come accurate to a 4,000th of an inch. And I guarantee you won't get that if you do it by hand, no matter how careful you are. The boat will still go together. But we have a commitment more so than any of our competition. We did right from the start to kit distribution and manufacture. We've never focused on plans. And there's a whole story about that another time.
Yeah, okay. Very cool. So the kit comes with the wood, the epoxy, the fiberglass tape, the copper wire for the stitch and glue part, pretty much everything but the finish products to paint or varnish. Is that right, John?
Right.
Okay, so you get everything and you get instructions, and if they have questions while they're building, they can call and ask, right?
Right.
Which is awesome.
So the painting supplies is pretty much it.
Yeah.
You know, you'll need to get rollers and roller trays and roller liners and more rubber gloves. We sell you flu rubber gloves.
Foam brushes and stuff like that.
Tons of foam brushes. I think we even include a couple of those, but you know, it's just gets you started.
Very cool.
And there's really you do almost no cutting of wood. It's essentially a sewing, stitching the boats together, and a glassing job.
And kit prices start at approximately what amount, John?
I think for the
$900 or $1,000.
Yeah, I think it's like $850 to maybe $1,050.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure what our smallest boats.
Yeah. Very
cost
good.
off the top of my head.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time today, John. I really appreciate it. This has been fun.
You're welcome.
We'll have you back again.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Okay. Thanks, John. Thanks, John, for doing that interview. I really enjoyed spending some time with you and finding out what you've been up to. with your boating and your youth and all that stuff. Very cool story, and I wish you the best with Pygmy Boats in the future. And by the way, I just got a copy of your catalog, which is really awesome. You guys have great artwork, and it's just very professionally done, so thanks for sending me one of those. Next week is an interview with Robert Darcy, Captain Robert Darcy, and he is the captain of the schooner Martha, which is a B.B. Crowninshield designed boat that was built in 1907, I believe. So stick around next week and find out some fun stuff about Robert and the schooner Martha. I would really love to get feedback from you, comments, questions, suggestions, anything like that. You can send me an email, dan@hookedonwoodenboats.com. You can subscribe to my e-newsletter. To do that, as I mentioned earlier, hookedonwoodenboats.com/subscribe. You can also subscribe to the podcast so that every Thursday when the podcast becomes available, it shows up or you get a notification. You can do that on iTunes on their podcast section of the store. You can do that by clicking on the RSS button on my website, hookedonwoodenboats.com. The RSS button is a little orange button. If you have Podcatcher software on your MP3 player or your phone, you can subscribe through your Podcatcher software. So, for example, on my iPhone, I have software, Podcatcher software, that is, called Pocket Casts, Pocketcasts. On there, I can subscribe to any podcast that's available. Each week or whenever they are published, I get notification on my phone, so that's pretty cool. You can also call my voicemail feedback hotline at 424-261-2360. If you'd like to support Hooked on Wooden Boats financially, you can do so by making purchases through my website on Amazon's website. If you go to the resources page of my website, click on any Amazon product and go to Amazon. And if you make a purchase, I get paid a little bit there. Also on my homepage is a banner for Jamestown Distributors, which sell boat building and marine supplies, great prices, fast shipping. I shop there myself. And if you click on their banner and make a purchase on their site, I get paid a little bit. And also on my site, I have a store where you can buy apparel and different products like bumper stickers, flip-flops, t-shirts, hats, things like that with the Hooked on Wooden Boats graphics on them. And if you purchase those, not only do you look really cool, because the Hooked on Wooden Boats graphic is awesome, but I make a little bit of money. And I think to date I've made $70 on the podcast over the last 15 months. Not quite enough to retire on, but hey, that's all right. I'm going to keep doing it anyway. That's about it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Great having you on the show. Keep the bright side up and the barnacled side down. This is Wooden Boat Dan, over and out. Have a great week.